Namaste and good evening. On behalf of IMPRI Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhav Evam Niti Anusandhan Sansthan, Nai Delhi, I Ritika Gupta, Assistant Director at IMPRI, welcome you to IMPRI #Web Policy Talk. Today we have gathered here for a panel discussion on Pandemic and Union Budget 2021, Implementation and Way Forward. I would now like to invite our moderator for today, Dr. Arjun Kumar, who is Director at IMPRI and China India Visiting Fellow at Ashoka University. Sir, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ritika, and I welcome all of you to this very pertinent panel discussion on pandemic and the Union Budget 2021 implementation and the way forward. As we all know that last week the Union Budget has come, so we are gathered here with our distinguished panelists to discuss over the same. So without any further ado, let me introduce the chair for today's deliberation. We also have a very distinguished panel today. So Professor Arun Kumar would be chairing this deliberation, and let me introduce him. Professor Arun Kumar taught economics in Jawaharlal Nehru University at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning, CSP, at School of Social Sciences from 1984 to 2015. He was the Sukhma Chakravarty Chair Professor at CSP JNU and was also the former chairperson of the same. He was also president of the JNU Teachers Association in 2014, and he has been a vice president and acting president of the Indian Academy of Social Sciences. Currently, Professor Arun Kumar is the Malcolm S. Adiseshiah Chair Professor at Institute of Social Sciences, ISS, New Delhi. Sir has specialized in development, public finance, public policy, macroeconomics, economic, social, environmental, also political issues also, Sir do writes on. And Sir was awarded the Ricardo Prize in Economics by IIES of UNAM, Mexico in 2013. Sir has written on issues of public finance, public policy, globalization since last 4 decades. He has been published several journal articles, many books. A recent book has also come. We also had distinguished lecture from Professor Arun Kumar sir, and also his book has come on the pandemic. So without any further ado, I would like to have the welcome remarks by Professor Arun Kumar. Then subsequently we can go to our panelist. Professor Arun Kumar, over to you.
So thank you, Arjun, for this introduction and for organizing this panel discussion on a very important issue. We are all concerned because this union budget has been presented after a very, very bad time that the economy has had. The pandemic led to a collapse of the economy in the month of April, May, and officially the economy has declined by only 7.7%. But my argument has been that it's declined by about 29%. It's a unprecedented situation. So the questions that arise, and I think the panelists would address what they would like to address, but I'd raise some of the issues that I think would arise. That is, the budget is a macro instrument first, and then a micro instrument. If the macro is not right, then the micro also tends to get confused and does not get implemented. For instance, if the economy can be boosted by even 2%, that would mean an extra 4 lakh crores of incomes. So whatever you do in the budget, will not match a fall of 2% in the rate of growth or a rise in the 2% rate of growth, which would then affect different segments of society. So, we need to understand how this budget is going to deal with the present crisis that the economy faces. We are, of course, after the lockdown, we are emerging from the low that was there in April, May. But my estimate is that we are still 10% below last year, 2020 January. The unorganized sector has not yet recovered. Major components of the services sector have not yet recovered. So the economy is still facing huge challenges. And the vaccination would take at least a year because we have to vaccinate 138 crore people. To produce that many doses and to vaccinate everybody will take time. The new variants that have come, South African, British, etc., are creating a scare. Just yesterday, the South Africans have stopped the AstraZeneca vaccination because they find that it's not helping in mild cases of the coronavirus. So there's a lot of uncertainty that is there, and given the uncertainty, the question is, what is it that the government can do? What is it that the budget has done, and what should it have done? These are some of the questions that arise in this context. And I'm sure the panelists will reflect on some of these issues along with whatever they have in mind.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, sir. And we have our panelist, Dr. Jyotsna Jha, who's joining from Bangalore, Malini ma'am joining from Delhi, and Professor Jyoti Chandiramani also joining from Pune. So to start our panel discussion, let us go to our first panelist, Malini Chakravarty ma'am, who is Associate Director Research at the Center for Budget and Governance Accountability, CBGA, New Delhi. And she has a master's in economics from Delhi School of Economics, DSE, and an MPhil in economics from CSP, JNU. She has taught economics at various institutes and also worked as a researcher at ICRI at New Delhi. Her areas of interest include macroeconomics, public finance, equity, and development economics. And she has authored many publications as well. Without any further ado, Malini ma'am, over to you.
Thank you so much. First, let me begin by thanking IMPRI India for this invitation. We are delighted to be part of this. I don't want to waste too much time because we have 10 minutes. So I'll begin by sharing with you all the analysis done by Center for Budget and Governance Accountability. That is CBGA. We do an analysis, very quick analysis, usually the day after or 2 days after the budget is presented. We have done a similar thing this year also. And we also answer perhaps or try and look at some of the issues that Professor Arun Kumar raised. So let me start sharing my screen. Is it?
Yes.
Yes,
Yes.
it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, we know the context of the budget this time is very unusual. So in a sense, one expected that, the similar things what has been happening over the years won't happen this year. We have had high unemployment, hunger, destitution, widening social and economic inequalities, which have not gone away even now. In fact, even when you look at unemployment, which have declined somewhat, we see employment taking forms of more precarious forms of employment. So, of course, we have the overburdened and under-resourced health system. We also have state finances under huge strain. In fact, it's state and center-state relations are going through a very strenuous period. All these have implications for the budget. The budget is also presented in the context of the 15 Finance Commission recommendations have been taken into account. Now, if you look at the broad fiscal indicators, these are for BE, RE, and BE for the coming year. The impression one gets is that, expenditure has, at least between 2021 BE and 2021 RE, has gone up by 4.1 lakh crore, goes down slightly compared to RE for the coming year. So, of course, the increase in expenditure has, along with the decline in receipts, translated into a huge ballooning fiscal deficit. But if you look at the composition of actual expenditure, and what we call as the additional expenditure, which is basically the fiscal stimulus, then we see that, earlier dues, whether it is for food subsidy or fertilizer subsidy, these are now being brought into the budget. So earlier they would be off budget. Now they're showing as part of the budget. So certainly 65 to 70% of the increase that we see compared to BE and RE is not actually additional spending, but something which the government owed. And now it is showing as a part of the budget. So 9.5% of GDP, fiscal deficit at 9.5% of GDP is an overestimation, definitely. And the same thing happens in this year budgets also, because we see that interest payments alone take up at least 25% of the supposed increase in expenditure. Now, without focusing too much on that, let me go on to the tax collection, what has been happening. One, we know that since the economy has been slowing down, uh, the tax collection fall that we see during COVID was happening earlier also. Of course, the COVID has made situations worse. But within this, if you look at the different components in tax, a very surprising thing comes up. You see, tax collections have fallen compared to BE when we look at the RE for this year. You see in GST, corporation tax, income tax, across the board, there's a fall except for excise duty. The excise duty fall, you actually see an increase, and that's mainly because the government has imposed additional levies on fuel, whether it's petrol or diesel. Now, coming on to the coming year and the last budgets, what we see that the government actually doesn't expect any of these taxes to go up much except for excise duties. So this is surprising because we know excise duties are inflationary and regressive, and they affect the poor the most. So in a sense, what has happened is where right when the government was expected to put money in the hands of the people, we have seen another route through which, because of rise in prices, the money is going out of the hands of the people. Now, of course, the other issue which has become very contentious, which has been partly kind of mentioned in the 15th Finance Commission, is that of the center state sharing of resources. Thankfully, and unlike what was apprehended, the 15th Finance Commission has retained the vertical devolution at 41%. And also, there has been some nice, good things that have been done when it comes to the horizontal devolution. They brought in the demographic aspect this time. But when it comes to the the part which is not shared with the states, as this graph shows, it has gone up significantly. And this is, I'm just talking about few years. One can put it in context that in 2000 2001 it was about 3%. Right now we expect it to be 20% at least. So this part of the tax collections never gets shared with the states. Coming to what has been happening, does the budget say about different social sectors? Of course, the first thing one needs to start with perhaps is the health spending. We did hear that the budget speech said that 137% rise in health expenditure. Looking a little closely, it says health and wellness. And therefore, what we have not just health and family welfare, but we also have uh, allocation for drinking water and sanitation, even for vaccination, which is a one-time thing, coming under the health budget or the health and wellness budget. The surprising thing is even FC grants, whether it's for health or water and sanitation, which is not really for the central government to decide because it's constitutionally given by the FC or the Finance Commission, they are also coming under the health budget. So our analysis shows that if we look at the core allocations for what is usually taken as health, which is Ministry of Health and Family Welfare and Ministry of Ayush. Therefore, we see that actually there's slight increase from BE 2021 to BE 21-22, but a fall compared to RE of the ongoing year. Obviously, then they are not in line with what one was expecting, that this was the right time to increase your uh, spending on health. We see similar things because a lot of rationalizations happen. Strangely enough, we see similar things even in nutrition. We know that the latest NFHS survey shows terribly in, in nutrition indicators, but even then we actually see a decline. And this is a real cause for concern because we also see that for happening for ICDS and many other schemes. Similarly for education, I won't go into the details, but we see a absolute decline. And this has been borne largely by Department of School and Education and Literacy. What was expected is, this was a time when at least 320 million children have lost 1 year of schooling. We do not see anything in terms of their safe return to school. Secondly, this was also the budget when it's being presented after the NEP 20 has been announced. We don't see any allocation for that either. The other, perhaps the relatively lucky sector has been WASH, which is water and sanitization, health sanitization. And this is mainly on Jal Jeevan Mission scheme. But we also see a budget cut for rehabilitation of manual scavengers. Exactly what was required is this COVID-19 pandemic had exposed the need for having more expenditure on these, but we have a sharp cut. Swachh Bharat mission, it remains more or less at where it was, meaning that in real terms, there's been actually a decline. Agriculture, another sector, we actually see a cut. Now, the cut has happened across different sectors. We also see cut of about 10,000 crore rupees in one of the flagship schemes of Kisan Samman Nidhi, which was for giving 6,000 rupees to agriculture households per annum. So we see cut in that. We see cut in almost all other sectors. Similarly, in for women and children, I won't go into into the details, but just to say that we have seen huge rise in violence against women, and this is exactly the time when we see cut fall in allocations for schemes for protection or empowerment of women. We also see similar things happening for child budgets. Marginalized sections, again, we are aware how poorly implemented they are. Scholarship schemes, for instance, tend to be have poor coverage, are underfunded with very small unit costs. But we again see absolute falls. Finally, marginalized sections, persons with disabilities, they have had one of the harshest impacts. COVID 19, particularly the lockdown, has had one of the harshest impacts. We see severe cut in budget. So, to sum it up, what we had expected is unusual times would have asked for an unusual budget allocation. We do see slightly, I mean, it is not expected, but we see cuts across several social sectors, also economic sectors. And we also see not much that the government is planning in terms of raising revenue, which can in a more equitable way. So this is the cover page of our publication. I would invite you to please have a look at it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Malini ma'am. Yes, ma'am, you can stop the share.
Yeah, have I stopped?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it has stopped. You can just stop this. Okay, no problem.
Thank you.
Okay. Let me quickly go to our next panelist. Ritika, if you can have the poster. Yes, so let me quickly go to our next panel.
Hello.
Yeah, I think we have
Hello?
lost.
Yeah.
We've lost him.
We've lost.
Yes, ma'am.
He's back.
Ma'am, please go on. Yes.
We didn't
Okay,
get to
good.
hear you introduce her.
There's some connection issue.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Do you want me to start?
Yes, please.
Okay. Okay. So I guess yeah, people know who I am. I'm Jyotsna from Center for Budget and Policy Studies, Bangalore, and okay, I'll also come directly to the point. So we heard Malini say, what the, analyze the trends and what we see in both revenue and expenditure and the gaps. I will raise some issues, those are linked. But before going to those details, I would also like to point out to the, budget as it's an annual financial statement, and it's a tool of accountability, like an annual financial statement for everybody else. Including institutions like ours, and therefore it matters how we present there. And as Malini was showing, and as many of us have pointed out in our writings, that there is a serious a problem when you try to hide the truth, because it's a statement that's available to public. It also shows how you perform financially and what your plans are for the future. And we have seen in context of health, she has explained, in other contexts also, like food and agriculture subsidy. So certain debts have been brought to the books, and therefore it looks like an increase, which it is not. And therefore that's something and the answer cannot be that this is not the first time. It has been happening, but that doesn't stop being an issue. So it's important to continue to raise this as a serious issue, and that's something we should be talking about. Coming to the budget itself, as Professor Arun Kumar was pointing out right in the beginning, that the GDP estimates that have come in economic survey and the budget seems to be too optimistic, and that's what we found. I mean, we have not done the all India analysis very rigorously, but we have done analysis for one or two states, and what we found that the GSDP declined, and it can be much more than what it is being shown for the national level, and this is also including states that are dependent much more on agriculture and core sector, and therefore perhaps are likely to perform better than the national average. So definitely that seems to be a too rosy a picture, and we hardly know a lot about unorganized sector, and whatever small surveys are telling us doesn't match with these projections. So there seems to be a problem. In terms of what has been suggested for revenue collection in the current scenario, focus on infrastructure, in my view, is in the right direction. But then there are more questions around that. It's not only that, infrastructure we say, and then just because it has potential multiplier for both income and employment and growth, but that it's good. It also, what kind of infrastructure you are going for, and which has, what kind of balance that particular choice has, because some choices can have higher multiplier for employment, whereas some other may have very low multiplier effect on employment, and therefore those choices matter, how it pushes the rest of the economy. For example, rural roads may be a better choice than something else. And similarly, how you are going to actually finance it. And the proposal that is there is foreign portfolio investment, that is FPI, which is largely NRI centered. Now, in the past, it has been, it's a short-term tool. And therefore, one doesn't know how it's going to really pan out in context of infrastructure investment, where it's the requirements are for long gestation investment. So one is not very confident of the projections again being correct. Similarly, the other measure that the budget has gone for is opening up of the insurance sector to FDI, and of course, this is so that will bring money to the economy, and therefore economy will grow, and therefore it will then percolate. Now, one important thing there is that if you are opening up insurance, a lot of health services are likely to go under that. And there one has a number of fears, going by what we see in India as well as across the world, what happens when your health services are highly insurance, say health finance dependent rather than health service dependent. And especially in terms of access to services becomes an issue for the poor and also for the rural areas. It's not only the poor, the location is very city centered, and that can be an issue. There are a number of other issues around that. A lot of gender inequality, actually, all our analysis shows that when you have health finance oriented health system rather than health service oriented, the gender disparities are much sharper. Poor use it less, women use it much less, rural population uses it much less. And therefore, Professor Kumar was talking about a kind of synchronization between macro and micro, and one is not sure whether that's going to happen if we have that kind of health services. And Malini has already talked about that. We have regressed in terms of immunization, in terms of a lot of other things, in terms of institutional delivery. So we have gone back. So in order to get back on track, we need much higher investments. We need much stronger public health services, and which is widely spread, and therefore it doesn't seem to match, going by what we need in response to post-COVID situation and what has been proposed. And next source of revenue is that, again, Malini has shown you all the graph that we are expecting a dip in corporate, sector, the income that revenue that we generate through corporation tax, corporate tax, and what has gone up is instruments like cess, something that doesn't go to divisible pool. And not only that, it's also the kind of things that one has gone for. One is this petrol and diesel cess that's highly inflationary and therefore also highly unequal in terms of its impact. So it's not a progressive taxation, it's a regressive taxation. And it's also especially the rhetoric of federal cooperation doesn't actually match with this. And the agri-infrastructure cess will actually reduce excise duty and result in lower tax share for the states, and which will perhaps increase their borrowings, and perhaps at a high rate because of also focus on infrastructure on the other hand. So there are states need to worry about these. If you come to expenditure side, in terms of, again, how you decide what your priorities are, you have seen that decline in women and child welfare, women and child development, decline in education, and decline in agriculture. And this is despite the fact that we have declined not from the previous year, but decline also in Narega as compared to the expenditure revised estimates for this year. And all that is, I would say, counterintuitive to the needs, because all the small surveys, and there are now, we have done a number of those, and many other organizations have done, many NGO partnerships have gone, and everywhere it's the same story. Different parts of the country, but the reports are the same, that the distress has been very high, income and livelihood losses have been severe, and children, dropping out is one issue, and there are many other issues. Children are likely to move away from private to public school because of affordability and also because of closure of budget private schools. And that means that public schools, the government schools, are going to face perhaps flight of good number of students, and they need to be prepared for that. On the other hand, what we see that there is a decline in school education, and that's completely not understandable. Even higher education, we need, if we are talking of actually growth, we need higher education much more, and public education much more. We have anyway very, very low growth rate of public higher education. So we don't see any change. It's actually going down, and there is an issue. And these are like half of our population. Children are, we have been to field in post-COVID period, and we are now seeing not only, instead of child marriage is being reported, we are seeing actually children being engaged in all forms of labor. In one of the states, we actually saw boys being engaged in bootlegging, and that kind of thing is happening. And therefore I would say one would expect a huge mass social mobilization against child labor, child marriage, resumption of public health services, very strong public education services. All these were the need of the hour, which we don't see actually budget going for. And coming back, so to one point that economic survey was trying very strongly to make almost like, I mean, obviously that's what economic surveys do, but it was doing perhaps much, much, much more flamboyantly, was bring forth the growth versus inequality debate. And the budget has, talked of growth and has not gone to any measure that would address inequality. So growth does help in poverty, and it has helped in the past in terms of bringing people above poverty line, but that's not about inequality. That's also not about distress. The way we define poverty line is very, very minimal kind of definition, and it's just a line that we talk about. And the kind of growth that we are talking may not be even good. It could be a jobless growth. It could be actually a kind of growth which would not address the issue of livelihood, issue of employment, and definitely not the issues of equality. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. So thank you so much for sharing your opening remarks. So let me quickly go to our next panelist, who is Professor Jyoti Chandinamani, ma'am. Yes. Jyoti, ma'am, are you there?
I'm there. I'm just sharing my screen. All right.
Ma'am, would you be sharing? Okay, let me just introduce Jyoti, ma'am, then.
I think you can avoid that. That's all right.
It's good for people to know, so it's okay, a few lines.
Yes, Professor Jyoti Chandinamani is now currently director at Symbiosis School of Economics and also dean at Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at Symbiosis International Deemed University, Pune. And ma'am has more than 35 years of experience in teaching, institution building, administration, and research. And Professor Chandinamani also teaches courses such as urban economic development, mobility, infrastructure, policy, and her research interest also lies in economics, sustainable development, urban development, environment, and so on. So, and ma'am has written also many books. So, ma'am, without any further ado, over to you. Ma'am, you can share the screen. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, is it visible?
Yes.
Just a second.
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to give a very, I think my earlier two panelists, Malini and Jyotsna, have set the context very brilliantly. So I'm just going to add on to what they have said. And yes, the budget, I think, was very well camouflaged, beginning with the 6 pillars that you talk about, health and well-being. Obviously, in the backdrop of COVID, that was going to be very much a necessity. It talked about financial and physical capital coming in, especially you needed the investment push, and talked about FDI, be it in the insurance sector, or in May, it had already talked about FDI in the defense sector. With respect to infrastructure, also there's been a great push, and inclusive development, as talked by Jyotsna and Malini earlier, that there has been a lot of talk about bare necessities, which is chapter 10 of the economic survey. And you can see that has been talked about, and a lot of allocation of resources is done over a 5-year period. So is it actually a tool for a 1-year assessment of a budget, or are you looking at a 5-year plan, is something that we really need to look at. You're reinvigorating human capital and innovation. I mean, today we are at this junction where so much of so much of innovation that that transformation that may likely happen, that we really don't know in which direction we are moving. We are moving to EVs. We may be moving to different modes of communication in the years ahead, but really don't know. And we talk about minimum government and maximum governance, which was a 6th pillar. And even then, when you look at the ease of doing business, you realize that there are 3 to 4 different pillars, especially when it comes to starting a business, your contracts, registering properties, and various others, where we rank very, very lowly, even though we stand on 63 in the ease of doing business index. So I won't go into this because this has already been talked about. Where does the money come from and where does the money go? And what I'll really come down to straight is, because I'm going to be talking about the expenditure and the noises made in the economic survey and in the budget. They are in sync, but in reality, I feel what really gets underlined is we need to look at the impact assessment and evaluation of a lot of these schemes, as rightly put so by Jyotsna, that when we look at things and at the ground reality, you know, whether we work with NGOs or we ourselves do field work, you realize even bare portable drinking water in villages, there may be a village with maybe 200 toilets, but the water is just not there. So looking at these total expenditure that is on this slide, you can see that in 2011, in 2021-22, it's barely just about the same, very much slightly above what was there in 2020-21. So a lot of people over the last decade have called it the decade of, you know, the last decade. We've had demonetization, we've had GST, we've had the pandemic, we've had the first 5 years of the decade 2010 to 2015, which had a lot of angst in terms of one government taking over from the other with a corruption rate, that we realized that a lot of policy changes that took place have brought about a certain sense of a lost decade during this period. Uh, Capital investment has surely come down by almost 10%. And the GDP ratio, savings GDP ratio, has also come down. But yet today we talk about, in lieu of growth, though growth has declined very drastically, we are now talking about a whole chapter on bare necessities. And if you look at the budget speech, both of them are very well synchronized. I cannot doubt that at all. But what are the emoluments are much, much lower. In terms of health, we know that this was going to be increased because of the pandemic. And you can see the various other modes. I won't again dwell on this much because both Jyotsna and Malini have talked about these kind of expenditures that have either been static or have declined. And if you couple them up with a number of other headings, then they look much, much larger than life. So we have to really see that there was no fiscal space. And given the fact that fiscal space was limited, this is what has come out for us. I go back to urban from where I come. And I mean, I have to admit that both the economic survey and the budget did somehow talk about this. But what is the emolument, assigned to it is something that we will just see as we move down. So there was this ease of living index. Cities are really becoming less sustainable because with GST and the center state relations, the way it is, the taxes going down to the state really is much less than what has been expected. So states are not able to perform as well as they would like to, but yet they are being measured on all indicators, which make it difficult for it to, balance the act. The bare necessities, which talked about where, the index which has been created for all the states, talked about water, sanitation, housing, and micro environment and other facilities. In fact, literally, when you look at the Urban Swachh Bharat Mission 2, the emoluments that have been set aside for 5 years is 1,41,678 crores, and over a 5-year period. But you do not know how much is going to be earmarked in the first year and what's going to happen subsequently. Now, Jal Jeevan, here you have 2,87,000 crores again over 5 years. The clean air, which has come in 2,217 crores, is down from the earlier estimate of 4,400 crores of last year. And similarly, you can see that the public bus transport system that has been talked about, they're talking about 18,000 crores over here with 20,000 new buses in public private partnership. As I said, this is at least after JNNURM, the buses are again being talked about. That means 2005, after almost 15 years, you're talking about public transport in a different way. Amrut also has its outlays, which have, yes, increased to a certain extent. And the Ruben also has about a 61% increase in this particular budget. So these are very marginal amounts allocated. And why I find these very marginal allocated, because, when I look at the way we define urban, I'll come straight to this last slide of mine, because I think this is what is most important. The way we define urban is very stringent, and the way the global order and various other countries look at urban is very different. And what we have seen is that the urban population and the urban cluster, which almost account for more than 75% to 78% of the population, if you look at this particular diagram that I have showed you, this particular graph. And when you look at the built up area, you find that the built up area is very high in both of them. But in terms of land, it's much more in the rural segment out here. Now, coming back from here, I'll come to this, that the number of census towns that are going to increase, at the end of the census that is going to be, calculated shortly, would be almost 2231 new census towns, which would mean 17.9 million more people getting included into being defined urban, but being governed by rural. And and one of the biggest problems over here is the governance of census towns. You're expecting rural panchayats to take care of urban looking, habitats with the kind of infrastructure which is going to be lacking. And again, if you look at the very large villages, which are, about 10,000, and large villages above 5,000 population, there are nearly 24,000 such villages that would come in. And if you look at the total population, this becomes 208 million people who do not fall into urban, but because of the definition, and therefore have not even found place in the budget analysis, in terms of though there has been talk about bare necessities and essential bare necessities index, or bare necessities that are required in the economic survey, and even in the speech, how much is this going to translate is going to be very, very different. So this was what I wanted to highlight, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, ma'am. And without further ado, let us go to our chair. Arun, sir.
Okay.
Yes. Sir, would you like to share the screen?
Yeah. I'll just...
Please.
Can you see the screen?
Yes, yes. Sir, you can also go full screen. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Why is it not going full screen? Okay, now, yeah.
Now it's coming. Yes, please.
Okay, so what I'll be doing is presenting a macro picture, which is based on my article in EPW in September 26th of last year, and my book, which has come out now. So what I have been arguing is that today we are facing the greatest economic crisis, which has led to the collapse of the economy, and it's unprecedented, And the second thing is we are headed towards a new normal, and we need to plan for that, and the budget doesn't seem to do that. Now, as an introduction, I've already pointed out that the budget is really a macro thing, and we need to look at the macro argument. The part A of the speech usually spells out a lot of nice sounding things. And, that is what one needs to measure it with. And the budget, clearly has the Atmanirbhar Bharat scheme as the basis. And the framework of the Atmanirbhar Bharat scheme is the supply side rather than the demand side, which is what I think is needed at the current juncture. And I'll try and show that. So what are the expectations from the budget? As has already been mentioned, health is a great area which needed to have been focused on. But as has been already pointed out, the direct expenditure on health has come down as compared to the revised estimate from 82,445 crores to 74,602 crores. which is not very good because we need to increase our health infrastructure. What we have been hit by is the seventh virus in the last 20 years. We had SARS, MERS, Nipah, Zika, Ebola, and now this coronavirus. And fortunately, this virus is very virulent, but the mortality is not so high. Like in Ebola, 40 to 50% people who contracted the disease, had death. So, we need to be very careful, and we need a lot more allocation to research in this area. We needed to also increase allocations to agriculture and rural areas because of the kind of, the distress that has been there in the agriculture and rural areas, because of which farmers are protesting. Defense is another area that needed to be stepped up because of the problems we are having at the border, but these are not in evidence. Now, these give you some idea of what are the allocations, and you can see that the allocations are not going up very much in the critical areas. Agriculture and allied activities has actually come down. Education has come down compared to the budget estimate of last year. Health has come down as compared to the revised estimate, and rural development has come down. So all these things which needed to be stepped up have actually come down. So in a sense, there's a missing macro, and that's why part A of the speech, which usually starts by giving the macro picture of growth, of inflation, of balance of payment, etc., this time does not give that. Similarly, at the end of the budget speech, usually it is mentioned what are the additional revenues from the various tax proposals, and that is also not been given in this budget. And I think that's been done because the situation is not quite, conducive to a positive image. And that's why I think the finance ministers avoided that. So the current year has been facing a problem of demand shortage. As we know from the consumer survey and the business confidence survey, the confidence level has been down. There's been massive unemployment. And more than unemployment, I have been arguing that the loss of work is much greater than the unemployment recorded by various agencies. So for instance, my factory is closed, but and therefore I'm not working, but I'm still employed. I may be in a school which is closed down, so I'm employed but not working. So like that, I've been arguing that the loss of work is much greater than the loss of employment. So this is something that needs to be taken into account. So the need was to step up expenditure sharply so as to generate demand. And as has been already pointed out by the other speakers, expenditure budgeted for is 34.8 lakh crores, but that's barely above the 34.5 lakh crore of the revised estimate that was there. Now, given that the private sector demand has been down, that needed to be compensated to boost growth, but that's not in evidence. The other thing is the fiscal deficit, which is estimated 9.5%, but overall, I think it's about 20%, because there are off-balance sheet items that are still not cleaned up. There are state, governments which will come in at about 5 to 5.5%, and then of course there are the public sector. So the overall fiscal deficit, which is represented by the borrowing requirements of the public sector, would be around 20%. Now, in the coming year, it is going to be down to 6.8%. But it's going to be higher because I think revenues will not come out to be what the government is saying. Now, this 9.5% also is really not 9.5% because it involves 3 lakh crores of transfers to the FCI and also for fertilizer subsidy. So I think roughly, the fiscal deficit of the center, which could boost demand, is roughly about 6.5% only. In that sense, the demand boosting component of the fiscal deficit remains roughly the same as far as the center is concerned. Now, as a result, two problems arise. One is that your expenditure level is the same, and the deficit formally also is roughly falling. So the question is, these are two sources through which demand could be generated by the public sector. But if they are going to be not there, then how would extra demand be generated? And that leads to further problem. Firstly, the deficit for the coming year would be higher because, as I said, revenues would be short. And secondly, that usually when the fiscal deficit shoots up, the government cuts back capital items and social sector items. So in a sense, this 7.7% rate of growth that is being talked about, or rather the decline that's being talked about, actually is going to be much larger because the unorganized sector data doesn't get included in this quarterly estimate and the annual estimate that is being given. So in a sense, we needed to support the unorganized sector, the social sector, and the capital items. And as the fiscal deficit rises in the coming year, then those will be the ones that will be cut back. So the other aspect that also needs to be taken into account in this context is that, how to boost demand quickly, which has been curtailed for 2021-22, because schemes like Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, National Social Assistance Program, PM Awas, PM Kisan, and food subsidy, which could have boosted demand quickly, they are the precise ones that have been curtailed. So in a sense, that's going to create a problem for the economy, that immediate demand would not be boosted, employment would not be boosted, and therefore there'd be a problem. Now, business sentiment has also been down. So what the government is trying to do is it has signaled via, it was expected that there'd be some COVID tax and cess, etc. By not implementing that COVID tax or cess or the wealth tax, etc., the government is signaling that it's going to promote business. Disinvestment and monetization of assets is also designed to boost business sentiment, and the sale of public sector assets, disinvestment of LIC, etc. These are all the ways in which the government is trying to boost the sentiment of businesses which are not investing as much as is required in the economy. Now, as far as the public sector is concerned, there's minimum government and maximum governance. That is a slogan that has been given, and therefore public sector is being dismantled. But the point is that the pandemic shows to us that the public sector is even more needed rather than earlier, because it's the public sector that was used by the government to keep the economy going, whether it be the railways or the airways, or whether it be, the public distribution system, or the succor given to the poor people, or the health infrastructure. It was the public sector. So what we need is a more efficient public sector rather than a disinvested public sector. Also, what is clear is that the market failure is widespread in a capitalist economy as it gets more and more complex, and therefore it requires more of public sector and more of intervention rather than less of intervention. The problem that has arisen is because of cronyism in the public sector, and that requires accountability. So it's not that we need less rules, but we need better implementation of rules. Rules are circumvented by the cronyism, and unless we clean up our politics, this problem is not going to disappear. So the problem is not public sector, problem is cronyism, and that requires politics to be cleaned up. Now let's look at investment and disinvestment. The public investment is being stepped up from 4.39 lakh crores to 5.54 lakh crores. But I have been arguing for the last 25 years that this has to be netted out of the disinvestment, because that's capital that you're giving up, and you are using that to build some other capital. So the private sector, which would buy public sector assets, is not going to invest elsewhere, it's going to invest here. So in the net, disinvestment does not increase capital expenditure in the economy, and therefore we need to net it out of the government's capital expenditure. If we do that, then we find that the capital investment is not going to go up. The other problem with this is, as has already been pointed out, most of the capital investment that is slated by the government is going into capital intensive areas like big roads and big freight corridors and things like that. Now, when I was a child, I used to see that road projects would have hundreds of people working, but now you see big bulldozers and big tractors, etc., with hardly 5 or 10 people working on these big projects that are taken up. So therefore, in the net, the employment generation would not be there, because these are very capital intensive items, whereas we are cutting back on the labor intensive areas, as I'd already pointed out, like Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme and other such areas. So therefore, we are not going to have a lot more employment as a result of this investment program in the capital intensive areas. Further, these capital intensive areas are long gestation or medium gestation, whereas the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, etc., are immediate. So therefore, again, that will mean that there'll be less of employment at present, even if there's some more employment later on. Again, in the allocation of projects, it's very likely that there'll be crony capitalism. We have been seeing in the case of various projects, for instance, that the favorites are being helped So, for instance, there are new monopolies that have been created in airports, in ports, in telecom, etc., which is all being designed in such a way. The next issue is that, given that the fiscal deficit is likely to rise, there's going to be a shortfall in the capital expenditure, as has mostly been the case, not this last year, but as has mostly been the case. So it's very likely that, there may be shortfall in capital expenditures again. Also, there's likely to be more political opposition, as we see in the case of farm, law changes. If you try and privatize railways and, monetize the assets, and you try and privatize various public sector units, the various trade unions are already protesting. So, the farmers movement, where there's a lot of protest going on, you add to that, the protest movements from the workers, and that would disrupt the economy. In such a situation, the increase in private investment is very unlikely to take place. What we instead needed was, local infrastructure to be created, education and health to be boosted. Those are precisely the areas that are being cut. There's talk of monetization of assets, but monetization of assets to a very large extent, if you do that very quickly, when a lot of assets come to the market, in a short time, asset prices will drop. And again, therefore, the crony capitalists will buy those assets. But the problem is that asset prices fall would adversely affect the private investment also. Now, there are various taxation-related issues which we need to worry about, like, for instance, GST-related issues, direct tax. We needed the direct tax code and simplification of direct taxes. I don't see that really happening at the moment. And we have been dependent more on indirect taxes than on direct taxes. Direct taxes have fallen. So we are more dependent on the regressive component of the taxes, So I would not say more given the time constraint. Then there are the other issues that we need to flag, like, for instance, there's talk of self-reliance, the Atmanirbhar Bharat scheme. But then on the other hand, we are talking about attracting more foreign investment. So this is contradictory. Rise in foreign exchange reserves is taking place because of the sharp fall in imports, but that only means less activity rather than something positive at the moment. Share market rise is also reflective of the growing financial sector instability. And then, of course, there are political aspects that the allocations are more to the states that are going to the polls, and fiscal federalism is being dented. Now, to conclude, one can say that the finance minister has not taken the correct macro into account and missed an opportunity to bring the economy faster on its tracks. After the lockdown is over, quite clear the economy is recovering, but is not recovering as fast as it could if the government had actually, given more employment generating schemes and, put purchasing power in the hand of the poor people. So rather than structural changes, which is what supply side means, what we needed to do was boost demand. And higher deficits should have been resorted to, both in the current year and the next year. And at present, where every country is running a high fiscal deficit, the US with a $900 billion and then a $3 trillion program earlier has already a 20+% fiscal deficit. So to boost demand and production, we needed to do that. And what we are doing is we are headed towards a new normal with a lot more automation, a lot more e-commerce, problems in education, and we needed to plan better for it. But we don't seem to have a scheme for that. So basic problems of education and unorganized sectors are not addressed. And rather than go for high cost infrastructure, what we needed was local infrastructure. Thanks for your patience.
Thank you, sir. So let us now also convene our panel discussion for the day. The government's focus also, because of the Atmanirbhar focus, has also been on the capex. Really, our thought also in economic survey also came that we should focus more on infrastructure, but that was also the thing that one should also spend more. So, sir, how do you also see that this packaging has?
I couldn't. Hello? I think Arjun?
Yeah, it's not audible.
Arjun? So
No, I think we lost.
Yeah, I think what he's asking is, about the capital item expenditures. And my take is that, whenever the fiscal deficit tends to rise, the government tends to cut back on capital expenditures because that's something new. So you can cut back. You cut back on social sector expenditures also. And those are precisely the areas that should not be cut back. So I think there'll be a problem in the coming year because revenues may be short, as compared to what is targeted, and that will then create a problem. But let other panelists also say what they would like to say on capital expenditures.
Yes, Malinam, would you like to go first? We should go in the same order. Yes.
Okay, so what I understand is exactly as Professor Arun Kumar has already said, that capital expenditure tends to be the one which is first cut along with social sector cut. This time, I think we have also seen some analysis which have pointed out very clearly that the huge increase in capital expenditure is focused on particularly three sectors, of which railways takes the largest share. And what we see instead is cutback in capital expenditure in many other sectors. So you have that even in health, where actually what we needed is infrastructure being built in health in rural areas. We do not see that. So the rise in capital expenditure that is happening is more of shifting to some other sectors, which again does not really lead to increase in employment because there's a lot more mechanization now. Again, something that Professor Arun Kumar has alluded to already. So, a lot of these things which could have been done, my sense is it is not being done actually.
Other members?
Right, Jyotsna ma'am. There is also, ma'am, I also wanted to add, that is also a new proposal during the pandemic also for migration, NMIS, information registry came. How do you see a new, also for informal workers, gig workers, new things are also planned, a new registry. How do you see all these things also happening?
Yeah, so I'll echo what I guess all of us have been trying to say, that if you say let's start with say migrant workers or workers in general. So it's not that labor sector doesn't need reforms. Yes, it does, but not the kind that has been brought even during pandemic. So when we were actually witnessing one of the worst kind of things that was happening to migrant laborers, and it was not happening because they were fools just walking to their hometowns in the middle of a pandemic. They were doing that because they had no other option. Their living conditions are atrocious. We have collected crores of rupees under construction cess, which is largely lying unutilized or perhaps has already been diverted and has not been spent on welfare of laborers, and so majority of migrant laborers have been living in a very atrocious kind of conditions, and therefore they were migrating back. Now what we saw in that in order to on the name of, say, for example, economic revival, you are bringing changes in labor laws which are further weakening their conditions, their rights. So we do need reforms, but not of the kind that are largely being brought, and that is true for many other things. So you need, for example, public sector, what Professor Kumar was talking about, that public sector does need reform, but not necessarily with the kind, you need stronger social security with stronger accountability. And I think the demand point is the most important point. There is an agreement the world over, perhaps, that we need to basically boost aggregate demand. And the best way of doing that is not by depending on corporate sector, which is not responding even to very low interest rates, has been extremely cautious, has been extremely and then they are guided by their own reasons for that. So you have to actually depend on large number of people who spend and who also need money. So therefore those sectors would have actually boosted the economy. It's not only that you are just distributing money. So those kinds of expenditures, as we I think our middle class is so attuned to thinking that those expenditures are basically a wasteful expenditure that they don't even see. And why I'm saying that's how the middle class has responded to the budget. They don't even see that money spent under Narega or under schemes that are giving money to, say, farmers are also coming back to create demand for industrial goods. And so that linkage is not even made obvious. And I think government also seems to have failed to see those linkages. And therefore, those who are spending, you're not giving money in their hands. And those who are actually saving, you are giving more and more incentives to them. So there is definitely a mismatch there.
Thank you, ma'am. And also, I wanted to next we'll go to Jyoti, ma'am. Ma'am, there has been also demand. Dr. Amit Basole, Professor Santosh Mehrotra, many experts have also been saying that the PM Kisan scheme should also be extended to rural poor households, those who are not farmers, and also for the urban context. And Jyoti, ma'am, you have touched about the urban sector. And also, I would like to add that US, be it Germany, European countries, they are also giving once again their furlough scheme or income support scheme for a monthly to the tune of $1,200 to $1,600. That has been the kind of support. Ma'am, what do you think? And I would also like to add from what Jyotsna ma'am said that in terms of PSUs, what China has been doing is to strengthen their PSUs even during this tough time. Ma'am, your comments on all these things. Jyoti, yes. Ma'am, please unmute yourself. Ma'am, please unmute.
Yeah, I'll go backwards from what you highlighted. Absolutely, I go with what you and Professor Arun Kumar say, because I think the 1956 public sector undertakings that we talked about, which really built India through, it's time really to revisit and strengthen the public sector undertakings. For having more capex, I feel we do definitely need to have a development financial institutions which are absent. And actually, this is something that was, discussed, in this budget. It was mentioned to a certain extent that, there would be 20,000 crores kept aside to, set up a development financial institution, because funding of capex projects is a problem. The current banks with the kind of NPAs that are there are going to come to light, and we are going to see a lot of challenges because of a lot of schemes that were given during the time of COVID under micro and MSME schemes, the Mudra funding that was there. You're going to find a lot of new NPAs getting added, and this is something that will have to again be factored. So coming back, development financial institution needs to come in. We used to have the IDBIs and the ICICIs and all those type of institutions. Like you have a NABARD, you probably need a national bank for urban transformation and development. I mean, as I said, that there is more of urban than what we would actually admit. And this is absolutely the need of the hour. And there are a large number of villages which look urban-like. So this is my one contribution. In terms of, you talked about the Narega that gets applied to urban, most definitely, because the number of people that lost jobs were there. But I don't think there is adequate fiscal space for that. When you look at it, in the economic survey, it accepts that poverty has moved from rural to urban. But yet, what are we doing in terms of it? We are just talking about probably taking care of the basic necessities, in that sense. But even livelihoods do matter. So I think development financial institutions, I think new banks coming up, the fact that you need to look at public sector undertakings more sharply. And I'm a little hopeful on, what came in today's papers also, and which was mentioned in the budget, which is really unlocking the value in assets through monetization. So I think this is something is how they'll have to take it forward. Otherwise, we are just going to be stuck with a game of numbers where we have very little room to play around with.
Thank you.
Arjun,
yes.
may I just,
Arun sir, yes, just coming to you. Yes,
wanted to add a few things in the context of what you were asking. VK Garg, who was the former finance secretary, has pointed out that the railways account have been fudged. by about 75,000 crores. What was actually the loss of the railways has been now funded, and that's been called capital item where it should be revenue item. So the capital account expenditure for this year has not really gone up, very much. So that's one thing that we need to be careful about in interpreting the budget. And I'm thankful to Mr. Garg, and I obviously, because he's the finance secretary earlier, he understands this very well. So he's made that point. Second is about the DFIs, the finance institutions. It's very important to have the DFIs like we used to have for long-term financing. But the question is, where will we raise the resources from? And then who will be able to get the resources? There, if you have cronyism again there'll be a problem of non-performing assets. And in India, to create high-cost infrastructure would again result in failure of programs. So like we've had road projects, power projects having failures, and therefore, because we're setting up high-cost infrastructure which a poor country cannot afford, then finally it comes down to the public sector. So I think the DFIs also have to be set up with a great deal of caution. And finally, regarding the fiscal space, the RBI is complaining that about 6 to 8 lakh crores of the funds with the banks are being invested in the reverse repo because there's not enough demand for credit. So this can be raised, to actually do it. And for that, I've been suggesting COVID bond. And similarly, there is two class of companies, one which are doing very well, whether it be from IT sector, telecom sector, etc. They're flush with funds, they could be also tapped for raising funds, through bonds, and then there are some upper middle class people who have extra funds. They could also be tapped to raise these funds. So the fiscal space can be enhanced provided we do it proactively and we actually, create the space for it. So my argument is that, a lot of space is available, which is not being utilized.
Thank you. Arun sir, also, because our minister also mentioned that the FRBM Act would be also tweaked, and we have increased from 6.8% to now around 10%, our targets also. And how do you see this rejig, and how the global community would see this as our continuity or predictability in terms of our accounts? As ma'am really highlighted, we also had something called Affordable Housing Fund. Until last year budget, we had 25,000 crores, and PMOAY, as we all know, both Grameen and urban, that has a major outlay. There has been, I would say, some deacceleration going forward into that. But really focusing upon the implementation part now, our finance minister also highlighting from last budget, the national infrastructure pipeline. Arun sir, how do you see this, that the focus on this infrastructure, which has been, I would say, the core of the Atmanirbhar package, also what we are going through? And sir, how do you see the notion of bad banks? There has been a lot of talk also that there should be a good bank and bad banks. And how do you see sir, disinvestment targets, 1.7 lakh crores? Is it achievable? What does our performance say? And would be able to raise the resources? And sir, I'm asking this because this has been an issue time and again, also in UPA government and this NDA government also. So whether going or pushing toward this, would we do not have, more spending toward urban employment or social policy from this fiscal space? How do you see that? Yes.
So, there are a lot of questions that you've raised all at once. I think we should go over these questions one at a time. For the last 2 years, I've been suggesting that we need a scheme similar to the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme for urban areas also, because the unorganized sector has been suffering after demonetization, GST, NBFC crisis, etc. And therefore, we need to generate a lot more urban jobs as well. So that's one. The question is, about resources. As I said, I think if we begin to invest, resources will get created. With the private sector on its own cannot increase investment until demand comes up. So it's a chicken and egg problem. So we need to boost demand. Only government can do that in this current context. If it does it, it will happen. Now, regarding the FRBM Act, I have never been a votary of the FRBM Act. Actually, the governments can always, in a situation of crisis, can always borrow more and spend more. If you look at, as I said in my own presentation, the US is now at about 20 to 25% of GDP as the fiscal deficit. All governments are increasing their fiscal deficit now. So India could have also done it. We have barely increased formally from 3.5% to 9.5%, which is barely very much, which is barely there. So I think, FRBM is something that we give up for the moment, and then we see how the economy revives, and then the tax resources will revive, then the fiscal deficit would automatically come down. And at that point, we could begin to think of wealth taxation and other such taxation, which at this point is a bit dicey to implement. So I think it's possible to do that. Disinvestment targets, I feel, if you look at monetization of assets, if you look at disinvestment and you look at other such programs, then a lot of assets will come in the market, and then the prices will collapse, of assets, which will then mean that the investment program of the private sector will not go through. So crony capitalism, as I suggested, would again take place. Bad bank is another issue which I think a lot of people are worried about, because again there'll be cronyism in that. Who would be able to benefit, who will not be able to do that? I think that about sort of sums up the various points, and I think other parts, speakers would also probably pitch in into this.
Yes, yes, Professor Arun sir, if you would like to pose any specific question to all the panelists so that we can go one more round.
Yeah, so I would say that,
Any particular
this,
issue? Yes.
yeah, I think broadly, I think we need to discuss this because it's a supply side package, and supply side package means we are giving, incentive to businesses, and through that, we're trying to raise the growth of the economy. So other panelists can also try and pitch in and see how they see this, this supply side package, and whether that would be, good for the current economy, because that's what the government is saying. Atmanirbhar Bharat is a supply side package. They say it's going to be good for the economy.
Right, Malini ma'am, over to you. And ma'am, as we also know that the supply side package, also we have something called ease of doing business. Our government is really focusing. In economic survey also, our chief economic advisor also showed that, state-wise, Delhi was topping in the corruption. How do you see the ease of doing business or ease of anything having that push on the ground, on the implementation? Yes.
Thank you so much, Arjun. Yeah, in terms of the supply side issues, of course, we know in a crisis, which is a demand-led crisis, supply side incentives will really not work. This we have seen even in the Atmanirbhar package, which is mainly focused on, providing easy loans and credits, which is again a supply side interventions. These work only when there is demand. That, this is a point that needs to be made again and again, and I think we have been making it, all analysts have been making this, that this is a demand side crisis. So you need to put money in the hands of the people, and when we say people, of course we don't mean people who have actually done better, because we know from Oxfam inequality report, for instance, that inequality has gone up significantly. We know that when it comes to employment, different sections of course been hurt, but it's the poor, it's those who are in the informal sector who have been hurt the most. Uh, Given all these things, that is what one expected from this budget actually, that uh, employment guarantee program for the urban area, some bit of it, as Professor Arun Kumar have already said, that increased allocation for various, whether it's health, for education, all these what was expected, because when the government provides it, that takes care of a part of the income which otherwise goes out from the household. So that by itself could have helped a lot and helped in reviving the economy, which we do not see. In terms of ease of doing business, there has been a lot of talk about it. But let's just say, when you do not have infrastructure, one, but not just infrastructure, when you do not have a productive workforce, you ease of business by itself is not going to help. We have had various rounds of this ease of doing business that has not really increased private sector investment. We have actually had a fall in private sector investment. In such a situation, unless and until the government spends, whether it is in the revenue side or the capital side, you really cannot have revival of the economy. Only if the government does, you will see revival of taxes, tax revenue, and various other indicators. So yes, because it focuses on the supply side issues, it really doesn't address the concerns that are important today. Thank you.
Thank you, Malini ma'am. Jyotsna ma'am, coming to you. And ma'am, one question I really also wanted to make, because most of, I would say, mainstream economists always say that there should not be anything new or very innovative in the budget just because of the continuity. And hence we see also not so much of changes. And most of the economists are also worried that you should not do this or that. How do you see, ma'am, this happening supply side focus? How much would it impact and have the implementation capabilities to have a dignified life to everyone? Jyotsna ma'am. Ma'am, can you hear us?
I think we can go to Professor Jyoti in the
Yes, Jyoti
meanwhile.
ma'am, over to you. Yes, ma'am, on this question only, as you will see in international arena also, we do see any newspaper, you will see all the concerns which we are making also there. But in thinking only, this has also come and inculcated also to all the economists also, that one should not differ away from what we are doing. One should not give money as doles or such sort of thing. How do you see this budget and this pandemic scenario?
There could be one way of. Am I audible? Yeah,
Yes.
I think I am. One way of looking at it is probably the government was not wanting to take a risk in doing, putting more money in the hands of the people, because they probably feel the sentiments are so low that nobody is going to really spend. Everybody is very cautious in terms of spending. So you're looking at the supply side. Now, if I'll just take a different perspective from here. If you remember, in 2000, we were really an power deficit nation. Today, we are a power surplus nation, all right? Or we are at least on par with that. So here, one of the things that they were talking about was enhancing the competition, so that individual consumer can actually decide who to take their power from, so that you get better quality assessment, back. So that's, if you look at the power sector over the 20 years, that definitely has come through. Now we are going back to, again, um, away from roti kapda or makan. We are talking about, of course, housing. We are talking about water. We are talking about sanitation. And uh, we have seen these changes in urban areas. Uh, if it is going to improve the livability of people, yes, that's when you can't have growth the way you want it. At least you feel you need to give dignity to life. So, in terms of in terms of principles, that seems fine, but it's not going to give you the growth that you're looking for sure, and it's not going to address the inequalities that exist in income, but maybe inequalities in terms of living, and ease of living will be definitely addressed. So I do feel, again, that sometimes when you do not know, if you feel that putting money in the hands of the people may not necessarily translate into expenditure, then supply side is a way to look at it, but the outcomes are not going to be growth focused, the manner in which we look for. But I go with Professor Malini and Professor Kumar, where there are spaces to be tapped so that you can infuse more investment, and that those spaces really need to be looked at, whether it was the COVID bonds or corporate, which are flushed with funds, which can be attracted, so that the development financial institutions need to come out far more. In terms of FDI, see, investments come in either from the government, they come in from the private sector, they come in from the foreign. And I don't think, the level of the economy, the way, the capacity to absorb investment is also a little limited, which is again left to the infrastructure, that is there. So I think trade facilitation, in fact, this budget didn't talk about anything to boost trade. In fact, that's the fourth accelerator onto hubs that they talked about. So here, I feel there is a lot of caution that the present government is taking in this regard.
Thank you, ma'am. And yes, coming back
Arjun,
to yes,
I think
yes.
given that the time is short, I think what we also need to discuss is what is the new normal we are headed towards, and what is it that the budget is doing to ease the thing into the new normal. For instance, there's going to be a lot more automation, a lot more e-commerce and e-banking and so on. That's going to cut back on employment generation. And then, what we also find is that the poor are unable to take care of their problem in a crisis. So we need to give living wage to everybody. How would we give living wage, if employment is not being generated? And the question that, if we are generating some kind of employment, but damaging the employment of the mass kind, then in the net, the employment generation will go down. So, these are things that, we need to worry about. What kind of public goods are needed to boost, for instance, Wi-Fi should be a public good. Then everybody can get education, even the poor people can get education. Similarly, health and education are also public goods. They have to be of far greater quality, So therefore, those things also need to be coming into our calculation. So the government needs to change focus, that given the lessons of pandemic, a local infrastructure is far more important than the big infrastructure projects of, big roads and big railways, etc. And that would also be a lot more employment generating. So I think the new normal is something that we need to focus on, So I'd like to hear the other panelists, on this, what are their thoughts on this new normal and what needs to be done in a budget?
Right. And sir, I would also like to add few points only to that. But so mostly I was coming with these points to you. Sir, the identification of beneficiaries. In the rural context, we had SCCC data. This has been one of the bottleneck also for the urban scenario. Sir, how do you see this? Time and again, NMIS, now a new committee, new database, new registry, we have employment exchange. Sir, how do we see this identification of beneficiaries? I think over 1 decade has passed, and also since Niti Aayog has been made, this has been one of the very preemptive issue. And where are we headed towards that? Two more issues which I also wanted to bring forth. One was our macroeconomic situation, which has been really strong. So where do we move from here? How do we utilize that? Can India be in any better position than what macroeconomic situation we have now, and what fiscal prudence or steps we can take? One another point I really thought to also have from our panelists was really on the cash part. Most of the schemes now, state governments in our federal setup are also not very happy, because all the cash schemes or the things our central government wants to give, for example, PM Kisan and other cash transfer. How do we see this arising? Because states are really being told that you have to invest so much on capex, then only you will get the these things. So all this scenario also the Prime Minister Digital Health Mission, something which was announced on 15th August, there is also nothing here. And Prime Minister Health and Wellness, PMJ Health and Wellness Center, a new scheme now has been also made time and again. So Malini ma'am, would you like to touch some of these issues?
Yeah, let me, there are quite a few. So what Professor Arun Kumar said, that, it's a new normal. And what do we see? What would have been expected from a budget? I'd just like to talk about the health sector, for instance, because, this is one area one would have expected that the government would increase, because, years of underfunding, especially public underfunding, has meant that our out-of-pocket expenses, especially for those who are poor, is extremely high. Now, if the government had actually spent, let's say, about 1.2 lakh crore on health, we could have actually invested in infrastructure development in rural areas, in districts. That would have also been helpful in increasing employment, because we have severe crunch in terms of human resources, whether it's doctors or nurses, especially in non-urban areas. So that would have also helped in, creating employment. Could have taken could have taken care of the problem of the employment crisis that we face today, and of course the demand problem. In terms of all the cash transfers that you talked about, if I remember correctly, yes, of course, these are things which should have been included. A lot of people have been saying that there's a minimum that needs to be given to every household. when you talk about, how do you identify beneficiaries? Of course, there's a problem with means testing or different kinds of targeting. So perhaps amount which will not be very beneficial for, let's say, well-to-do middle class, upper middle class families, but would be very important for lower income groups, could have been done. So this is I mean, it is rather surprising that this is what was needed was this, but what we actually see is cut in all these cash schemes. What was perhaps even more important was, and I think it was not expected at all, was the cut in Samman scheme, which is the 6,000 rupees per annum to agriculture households, because we know agriculture has been under distress and it is under distress, specifically during the lockdown. We have had farmers who have not been able to sell, have been selling to non-MSP prices, which is half of what they could have earned otherwise. So, with mandis being closed, we have farmers and households, farmer households have been hit very badly. So these are things which, of course, new normal would mean better healthcare, more spending on also workforce generation, and new normal would say, for instance, in case of education, we know that if we have to, even if we go back to normal, some bit would always remain digital education. So increased investment in, as Professor Arun Kumar said, in fact, Wi-Fi availability, Wi-Fi should be made a public good. But at the same time, it should also, not just Wi-Fi, of course, but also devices that, poor households do not have these. So if we have to go on with the new normal, and we do not want, a huge chunk of a future generation to fall out of education or get into child labor or early marriage, these are the essentials that would have been required. Thank you.
Thank you, Malini ma'am. Jyoti ma'am, just coming to you, as Arun sir really highlighted, in this new normal, also automatization, future of work, many of these things also coming. Ma'am, how do you see also in our urban context the focus on industries or the industrial corridor, other things also coming? Do you think in terms of implementation, that thing also taking the front, because Make in India and other push is really sort of missing in this budget? How do you see?
You can, as I said, you can push anybody to make in India, but till such time the basics of economics don't work when MEC is greater than the rate of interest. The typical way. If the returns are not there, nobody is going to really invest it. Till such time, you have the. So therefore, I do feel that animal spirits are totally absent in this regard, and therefore the onus lies very majorly on the government itself to invest in various. So that's where Professor Arun Kumar talked about public sector undertakings, and I felt that there is a need for. When I talked about urban, I talked about how large villages, cities, which are population, which is the rural class that we are talking about, there's no governance structure. So if you did create municipal councils, if you had the right amount of teacher student ratios, be it in in fact it is worse in urbans than in rural areas because of the high density of population. So I think a lot of employment and investment today, whether you like it or not, lies at the doorstep of the government, and that's where it will have to take this forward. See, earlier you had the private sector taking it, then you had foreign direct investment coming in, and like you have had the automobile sector really shine under the foreign direct investments that came in, where today we are a very large automobile industry, which has been with the Marutis and the Suzuki and Hyundai, and a large number of foreign players there. Of course, with the competition made our local players also pick up. But now that kind of an impetus is not yet coming. The signaling is there. The improvement on, let's say, ease of doing business partially is there. In ranking, it is there. But in ground reality is we don't enforce contracts, we don't pay taxes. So given those kind of micro situations that you talk about, or cultural deficits that do exist, how much of foreign investments is going to come in, I really do not know. But they have been pretty good, and I would say India's done well on that front. But animal spirits lacking, therefore the entire task of doing this business has to fall back onto the government and even generate employability. Otherwise, where else would you move forward? That's where the government is totally absent. You talk about disinvestments. Yes, it should have happened. But probably this time they should hit the road running, because the markets are up and they can, carry out the disinvestment plans very, very carefully. So the new normal really would be if government really looked at a retake at their role of of these aspects. You can have growth which has been jobless growth and job loss growth also. So I think that is something we have to address immediately.
Thank you, ma'am.
I think, Arjun, in this context, it's important to point out that there'll be two class of companies in the stock market. One which are going to do very well, like for instance, IT sector, telecom, FMCG, other such related areas. And that's why you see in the world today, it's the technology companies that are doing very well in the US and also in India. It's the Geo which brought in a lot of capital because, all these tech companies want to use the platform of Geo. And that's why a company, Reliance, which was the largest indebted company in the country, has become zero debt, So the FDI has flown into that. But I think, in general, FDI would come only when the economy picks up. If the economy does not pick up, well, if the rate of growth doesn't go up, then even FDI will not come into other areas. And there's also a move to deglobalize. The new normal is deglobalization, where Mr. Trump had asked US companies to return to the US. And European countries are also asking European capital to come back to Europe because they don't want such long supply chains, because in a pandemic or when supplies are disrupted, that disrupts the economy. So I think, we need to boost internal investment because FDI is only 5% of the total investment. So what we need to do is, because our investment rate has fallen from about 37, 38% in 2007-8 to the current level of maybe about 20%, it was 29% already before the pandemic, has fallen further. So we have a drop of 15, 16%, in the investment rate in the economy. That is what needs to be boosted. And that will be boosted only if demand picks up. If demand doesn't pick up, you're not going to invest just for the sake of investment, You will only if you are Maruti and you're producing, you have the capacity to produce 100 cars, but you're producing 70 because demand is for 70. Why would you increase capacity to 110? Only when the demand reaches 85, 90 would you increase it to 110. So I think demand is the crucial thing at the moment, which even foreign capital look at. So in some sectors they will come, but not in the general economy as a whole. And as a result, you cannot depend on FDI to boost internal investment,
Exactly.
Second is you were saying that, our macro is looking good. I don't know why you say that, because the rate of growth is down, rate of capital investment is down, savings are down, the fiscal deficit is high, the trade has a positive balance, but that's because imports are down, our foreign exchange reserves are risen because, of this flow of the FDI into the Reliance, etc., and also because our imports are down. But otherwise, that's not a healthy sign. So I don't think our macro is looking very good at this point of time, and we need to improve that macro through growth. Once we begin to have growth, I think things will improve.
Right. Thank
I
you,
would
sir.
like to point out one thing. This is regarding this disinvestment. Now, we have seen that our resource envelope is very, very small, right? But disinvestment, profits from various PSUs have been playing a larger and larger role because our tax revenue has been going down. So when we talk about, disinvestment, we must also think in terms of future, that it's not just selling away our silver today, but our future
Absolutely.
income is going to go down. So we have not thought of, bringing in more taxes other than the regressive taxes. Whereas we can, as Professor Arun Kumar already said, once the economy revives, we can also go in for other taxes on those who have the ability to pay and very super rich. But what is required again and again is for the economy to revive. And there's nothing so far in terms, and that requires a big fiscal stimulus. other than the government, nobody is going to do it. You do not have the animal spirits, you do not have the demand. Why would a private sector do it unless and until they can see profits in it? So therefore, even this whole thing of, disinvestment, I think it's one should think twice about it.
Thank you, ma'am. Now, also, Arun sir really highlighted last year that the recovery is looking at the K curve. Now, a lot of all our government is really focusing that the recovery is now moving the V shape. Most of the experts, also internationally, saying the recovery is sort of U curve. How our panelists also see this, and also towards the vision of $5 trillion, now also $10 trillion for 10 years. As we see agriculture, even with the good monsoon, the rate of growth 3%, 4%. And now also our target, manufacturing, the rate has been really 0, 1% negative. So all the onus is on service sector. Do we really see that rate of growth going to be 15, 20% year on year? How do we see our growth? And really in this deglobalization thing, I think now we can really have 2 minutes to our panelists to focus on the way forward, and especially the private investment internally not coming, as Professor Arjun Kumar is also highlighting. So how to make that happen? We should really focus. So Jyoti ma'am, would you like to go first? Then Malini ma'am, then Arun sir, would you like to then have a concluding remark?
Okay.
Yes. Jyoti ma'am, over to you.
Yeah, so when we typically look at the C plus I plus G plus X minus M that we look at, okay, at this junction, we feel, yes, the demand needs to be boosted, undoubtedly. That comes out of, putting more money in the hands of the people. But the government, of course, in this budget has looked at more supply side than the demand side. When it comes to the animal spirits are missing. So again, I think the creation of, I feel we have no choice but to have some new banks come in. And that should happen very quickly. There's already a panel in that regard. Of course, there is a talk that these new banks, if it comes from corporate, roots, then there would be a case of crony capitalism. But then if you're pushed into a corner, how do you again move out? Of course, there could be other sources of raising funds through, COVID bonds, etc. But I do feel new banks need to come in and new DFIs need to come in so that you can have long-term infrastructure funding taking place there, and probably a lot of subsidy coming in from government for that, because otherwise infrastructure is not going to, private investment is not going to come in. Otherwise, we've seen this happen in the past where infrastructure companies have folded up or they have sold out and moved out. So that's when it comes to infrastructure. Investments, again, as I said, I would again push forward the way that public sector undertakings need to go up. I feel employment generation is the prime, and whether it is healthcare workers, ASHA workers, nurses, etc., wherever you need to have those benchmarked things, then if you're really looking at creating supply, then that's where you have to come in with generating those typical jobs that come out from there. And while we have talked about Atmanirbhar Bharat, we've seen the East Asia, growth in the past where the Asian tigers did move on. And you've seen it with Vietnam, with Cambodia. I don't think we can do that without having a proper policy for exports also in place. So this is my, big picture. But I didn't see the budget do anything for exports, and I didn't see the budget do anything much for employability. Growth is left in terms of a push where you think it may happen, but it probably needs a deeper push for the investments to come in. But the other way around could have been in terms of putting more money in the hands of the people and hoping that they do spend and create the demand that was required.
Thank you, ma'am. Malini ma'am, over to you.
Yeah, so what I would say is the need of the hour is growth with redistribution. We have had that component missing so far. So if we have to have growth, we have seen what has been the growth pattern or the strategy of growth so far. It has also been prepped up by various kinds of bubbles. Now, we need to realign a bit, and a very good way of doing this is to invest more in social sectors. I just gave the example of health, what could have been done. You can actually do it in education also, as I think Jyotsna had pointed out, that you have schools which are you have a lot of parents who are perhaps going to take their children out of private schools and put them in government schools. So the government schools need to be prepared. The government schools need to have more teachers, and not teachers which are like para teachers. You need qualified teachers. You need to invest there. You that itself can generate employment. You can invest in women-led sectors, for instance asha anganwadi workers. We see nothing for them in the budget. They have been at the front line of this COVID-19 fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. That needs to go up. Their honorarium, they're still not seen as workers, they're seen as voluntary helpers. You need to increase their honorarium. There has been some increase, but that still remains very, very low. If you do these things, so what you're doing in the process, you're through various channels, you're actually putting hands in the money in the hands of the people. And why I say these people, there are less chances of them not spending it, because as it is, they have very little income. It is likely that they have taken debts. A lot of reports show that a lot of people have taken debts. Yes, a part of it would be perhaps for repaying debts, but they have no option but to pay. The fact that they have taken debts means they are actually spending. So, this kind of income going to them is likely to boost your domestic demand. But that would also mean a slight reorientation of the production structure of our economy. That has to mean more different kinds of goods which the lower income also wants. Again, I'm not sure whether the private sector would want to like to come in here. Maybe even the government can come in here. So there are different ways that the government can do through various social sectors or even in agriculture. This is the time when you need to have, bring back extensive agriculture extension services, which have been neglected for years on end. These lead to better productivity, better output, and also can lead to better income for the farmers. So yeah, these are some of the things I thought can be done, should have been done perhaps. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Before election also, we saw Anganwadi, AWW workers,
Yes.
things increasing, not this time. Very pertinent point. Arun sir, I really also wanted to ask one question to you also, because in US, that has been the debate. Something of minimum wage. Again, in US, $15 when the new President Biden has come in. How do you see, because also for the case of Anganwadi workers or para school teachers, also 2,000, 3,000, very less amount. Do you think that minimum wage as a lever, it can spur growth or also expenses in our economy? And sir, your concluding remarks also.
So,
Yes.
we need to look at the unorganized sector, which is 94% of the employment and 45% of the output that has been suffering, including agriculture. Because you see, after demonetization and GST, etc., what happened was that, your demand came down. And that's why farmers have been protesting for the last 3 years. Even before the 2019 election, you had mass protests in Maharashtra, around Delhi, Madhya Pradesh, farmers from Tamil Nadu coming, etc. And that's because their incomes are not rising. And that is because if 94% suffer loss of income, then demand for food comes down. And then during the pandemic, they really suffered because, as I've shown in my book, the Azadpur Mandi was getting less than half the fruits and vegetables, and the rest was rotting in the fields. So the prices in the urban areas went up, whereas the prices in rural areas at the farm level went down. So in fact, I've been arguing that the rate of growth of the agriculture sector also this year would be 0 and not 3.4%, because in the first quarter, it declined by at least 10%, agriculture. And given that fruits, vegetables, horticulture, pisciculture, etc., that is 50% of the agricultural output. And if that declined by 20%, then you can see that in the first quarter, agriculture declined. So the rate of growth of the economy has been down. The unorganized sector has been suffering. And this migration points to the fact that they don't have the purchasing power actually even to sustain themselves for a week. And that's what the Azim Premji study showed. Now, what it implies is that we need to give living wage to every worker. If you don't give living wage to every worker, then in a pandemic, they will suffer. During a crisis, they will suffer. And therefore, they'll not be able to take into account, whatever is required for them to sustain themselves. Large number of them don't have clean drinking water. What to talk about washing hands 3 or 4 times a day. They don't have toilets, so they have to mix. They have to go out to buy. And in urban areas, they may live 5 or 10 people to a room. How do they enclose themselves for 24 hours in a room? 5 people or 10 people. So I think the living conditions have to improve, which, whether it be education or ASHA workers or anybody, you need to pay a living wage to everybody. So that I think has to be a new normal. But the employment generation is going to be crucial because today there's a large amount of automation that's taking place in industry. And we are moving from brick and mortar stores to e-commerce. We are moving towards e-banking and teleconsultation and, medicine and various such things. So therefore, the job losses will be very substantial. So that's where we need to consider how to boost job creation in the economy. That's not going to come from the organized sector because organized sector doesn't generate large number of jobs. It's very capital intensive. As I said, if you build massive roads and railways projects, they directly do not generate jobs. There are very few jobs generated there. So you need local infrastructure. As has been already pointed out, if you increase the number of teachers in urban areas, because there may be 80 children to a class, make it 30 children to a class and employ more teachers. But you need to do a much better job because you have to pay the teachers more. Otherwise, the quality of teaching is very poor. And the quality of teaching also needs to be taken into account. As the ACER reports point out, that 50% children in the 5th class in rural areas are not able to read second class textbook, not able to write second class stuff, and not able to do second class maths. So teaching has to improve everywhere, for which you have to pay the teachers much more, you have to pay the ASHA workers much more, you have to pay the health workers much more. So, these budgets have to go up, That's why the new normal will require us to think anew about the kind of society we have. And that would then reduce the inequality because these public goods have to be of high quality. And then only the chance will be there for every child. At the moment, the children of the poor get very poor education, And, what Malini was saying, for that I have been proposing that, there just like libraries have books, there should be library of equipment, where the children of the poor can go, whether it be, computers that are available in those libraries. So in my book, I have proposed all these things, but time is short, so we cannot go into everything. But what I have been suggesting is that the recovery is gradual. Recovery, we cannot say V-shape because you see, V-shape means that as fast as the economy declined, it rose also. So it collapsed in April, May, but has been rising gradually and is still 10% below what it was in 2020 January. So therefore, the rise has been slow. So, we can say it's a shallow recovery, and because of the shallow recovery, the problems will continue. And the problems will come down only if the disease does not reassert and if we can do the vaccination, within the 1 year. So, we have to worry about the coming year. There'll be a lot of problems that will continue in the coming year, whether it be in education, whether it be in other terms, So I think we have to be very careful and not, celebrate that we have overcome the disease, very quickly. The virus is very tricky, as has been shown in Britain and South Africa and Brazil. The new strains come and the vaccination may not be, very effective against the new strains. So we have to be one step ahead. That means R&D. So massive investment in R&D is necessary, which means massive investment in higher education. Because without good higher education, you cannot have, good R&D. So look at China. China has invested massively in higher education, massively in R&D, and therefore they have jumped ahead. 5G, we have not even made 2G. They have gone and got the best 5G, which even the US is scared of, and the US is trying to prevent the Huawei 5G from spreading by saying there is a security risk. There may be a security risk, but it's shown that 5G coming from China is cheaper than elsewhere, and it's better also than elsewhere. So, we need to put in a lot more money into R&D, into education. So we need a total rethink of our policies. And the budget shows that we are not doing that. So as people say that a crisis is a time of opportunity. So this crisis is a time where we need to think of the collectivity. The pandemic shows that we are a collectivity. Until the last person has the disease, it can spread again, you know. And even the president of US is not immune from it. The home minister of India is not immune from it, So everybody, has to work together. So what the virus has shown is that we are a collectivity. We have to think collectively. And what this budget is doing is supply side, which is based on individuals. It's not based on the collectivity. So we need to rethink our philosophy about our society and how we can make India great again. Which is what the slogan that the Prime Minister has been giving. But that's not going to come through supply side. It's going to come through thinking about ourselves as a collectivity, that we have to get everybody together and move together.
Thank you. Thank you so much. In fact, sir, you mentioned Brazil. They also have Bolsa Familia program. They cover a lot of their population also through that transfer scheme. So thank you very much, all the panelists. We have really exceeded well above our time. So let me just propose a quick vote of thanks. Jyotsna ma'am is texting me that she is traveling, some issues also coming there. So thank you once again to all our panelists and all those who are watching here and also on Facebook Live and YouTube for coming here and attending this very special panel discussion on Pandemic and Union Budget 2021 implementation and the way forward. And we are very thankful from IMPRI and also Counterview to chair for this deliberation, Professor Arun Kumar, and all the panelists for today's deliberation, Malini ma'am, Jyoti ma'am, and also Jyotsna ma'am, for discussing on all these issues in detail. So thank you everyone and have a nice evening. And
thank you for organizing, Arjun. Thank you for organizing this, and thanks to the panelists for their views.
Yes,
thank you.
We will share.
And thank you, Professor Kumar, and thank you, Arjun. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay,
Have a nice
bye.
day. Thank you. Bye. Yes.
Good night.
Good night.